Hi everyone. Can you hear me fine? Just so I'm gonna change the pace a little
Yes.
bit from this amazing presentation about Celia. I do have to warn everybody. I will be talking about things about rape, abuse, and may have strong language. So just be warned. Um, so my presentation, as Dr. Shikane said, it's mostly based on Japanese occupation in the Korean Peninsula. A great quote that sums it up is Napoleon Bonaparte once said, "History is the version of past events that people have decided to agree upon." And this is especially contentious statement in the case of Japan and Korea. Especially in this presentation, I will be focusing on South Korea. This is in part due to the everlasting memory of the Japanese occupation in Korea and Southern Korea from the years of 1910 and 1945. South Korea continues to harbor resentful feelings against the Japanese for the harsh treatment displayed towards the Koreans. And Japan refuses to acknowledge the war crimes committed in the Korean Peninsula, creating an international dilemma that still affects the global stage 76 years later. South Korea believes in the recurring theme of historical injustice related to the wrongdoings done by Japan during the occupation. Koreans refer to the wrongdoings as the Korean comfort women, who were young girls being forced into prostitution at a young age by Japanese soldiers. The lack of evidence of this historical fact in Japanese textbooks, visits to the Yakuji shrine, and the lack of formal apology from the Japanese government. The Japanese claim that Korea has misinterpreted some of these events, but have apologized to Korea on numerous occasions by reaching a financial settlement for their wrongdoings. These ongoing issues affect the international relations between these two countries even after all of these years. Therefore, this leads to my thesis question of how can one historical event be remembered in two different ways, and what are the consequences of this disparity in perspective? Before we explain this occurrence, let's talk about some background information and what are some of the issues that occurred during the Japanese occupation in Korea. The Korean Peninsula was in an unstable situation at the end of the 19th century, and Japan took advantage of that and forced the Koreans to sign an unequal treaty that allowed Japan to tamper with the Korean politics. Japan forced the emperor to abdicate the throne in 1907, and the administration was given to the Japanese. Later, the Koreans were forced to pledge their loyalty to the Japanese government. In 1910, Korea was completely annexed to Japan, and Japan's excuse for this, or the driving force for colonization, was to push the white race out of Asia due to the West's growing influence in Eastern Asia. One of the major lasting events that the Koreans remember is the brutal treatment that the Japanese had with the Koreans during the occupation. The Japanese did not see them as human beings, as they believed that any enemy of the emperor could not be right. Therefore, the more brutal they treated their enemies, the more loyal they were being to the emperor. This factor, combined with the Japanese belief that they had ancestry from the divine, led to a proliferation of racial superiority. The dehumanization of the victims led to the belief that they were inferior, similar to animals, that helped credit this defense. Also, Japan believed themselves to be a superior nation and therefore had the duty to provide protection to the inferior nations from any outsiders, and in exchange, Korea had to uphold its place as an inferior nation. In this hierarchical scale, it was an important feature in the structure of the society to the belief that the Japanese it was perfectly acceptable for the Japanese to believe that everyone had a proper station, and it was ingrained in their social experience to have a specific role that they needed to maintain. Therefore, inequality was also an accepted fact. It is the belief that both who exercise control and those who are under someone's control act in conformity to a tradition that is ancient. Since Korea was considered part of Japanese empire, they were considered citizens but treated as second-rate subjects. Nearly half of the Korean residents were conscript workers pressed into service during the war and often maltreated. Japan needed Korea to provide manpower for the war, as 22 million Koreans were used for these tasks. Also, additionally, Japan wanted to erase the Korean identity and Korean language. They wanted to eliminate Korean surnames from existence. This was a great conflict that Koreans had still resent, as ancestor worship and genealogical records which serve as family and clan ties, are important notions in the Korean culture. The Japanese wanted the Koreans to change their surnames, therefore it's an unfailure act, meaning that they would deny their ancestors by assuming foreign names that exhibit no relation to their past. The Japanese regiment also attempted to force Japan's religion onto the Koreans. Koreans also had to cite the oath of imperial subjects, which is a daily bow to the east towards the imperial palace, and confirm their faith to the Japanese national by worshiping in Shinto shrines. By the end of the Second War, there were nearly 200,000 Koreans in the Japanese army, and they were mostly used in mines and factories, and the Korean labor slaves were viewed as inferior in the bottom of the Japanese hierarchy. They went to concentration camps where they worked long hours under abusive hierarchy, abusive Japanese superiors with little pay and food. And unfortunately, many of the victims in the Hiroshima nuclear bombing were Koreans, as they were brought over during the war. Nonetheless, the most prominent event that the Koreans have against the Japanese is how the treatment of the comfort woman issue. Between 1943 and 1945, the colonial government recruited 200,000 Korean women between the ages of 12 and 40. Some 50,000 to 70,000 were assigned to various war fronts as prostitutes. Before these sexual facilities were established, Japanese soldier Asuma testified. For the Japanese, rape was getting out of control, and it was against military regulations, so they needed to destroy the evidence. While the evidence were being fucked, basically, they were considered to be human. But when we killed them, they were just considered to be pigs. We felt no shame about it, no guilt. If we had, we couldn't have done it. As a result of this barbarism, rape was getting out of hand while it was causing a lot of resistance from the locals. So in a way to control it, they established these military brothels that were later coined into sexual comfort facilities near the front lines. They were filled with Korean, Chinese, and Southeast Asian, and some European women were taken from villages, towns, prisoner war camps all over the Japanese Empire. Most of these comfort women died of disease, murder, or enemy fire. A small testimony from one of the comfort women, which is Kim Bong-dun, said there were soldiers lining up everywhere outside the comfort stations. When one soldier was finished and walked out, it was immediately followed by another soldier walking in. Awful acts like rape, including gang rape, took place daily. She started at the young age of 14, and she was forced to engage in sexual activities back to back on a daily schedule of 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. every day. So you can imagine how many men she had to sleep with on a daily basis. Unfortunately, she's just one story of thousands of women who had experienced this. She had to experience this. Nonetheless, let's view how Japan and Korea have handled these issues over time. In 1951, after the Korean independence and foreign powers left Japan, Korea and Japan had a contentious diplomatic history that spanned 70 years. These two nations, in 1951, they were rushed into talks regarding pending issues from the post-war. Japanese delegates insisted on restricting considerations just on immediate issues, while the Korean delegates had a different opinion. They wanted to conclude this peace treaty and basically fix their relationship. Emotional nation began a new relationship. Nonetheless, these talks ended up causing more harm than any good, and Korea and Japan did not talk to each other for many years. The height of this contention was when Japanese Chief Delegate Kabuta said, Japan have reforested and denuded hills of Korea, reclaimed land, constructed facilities that greatly expanded Korea's rice production, built railroads, highways, schools, and government buildings, and poured millions of yen into Korean investments. This aggravated the Korean public, as it's basically saying as an excuse to the occupation, it's justified. Nonetheless, in 1965, Korea was going through an economic crisis, and Japan used this opportunity to provide loans and aid as a form of settlement for its colonial past. However, it did not come up with an apology. So it didn't really solve anything. And ultimately in 2015, there was another monetary agreement. However, this sparked controversy when the Korean public, as Japan, this caused controversy within the Korean public because Japan wanted a statue commemorating the comfort women to be removed in order to complete said agreement. So this sparked more issues within the Korean public as it's something that they want to keep remembering. So where are we now? This is a poll taken between Japan and Korea about what public opinion. So some of the results are that 71.6% of South Koreans responded that they either had a bad or relative bad impression of Japan. The younger generations were leading this trend as Japan's perception had plummeted. Additionally, nearly 90% of Korean respondents believe that the current state of Japan and South Korean relations are either going relatively bad or extremely bad. On the other hand, 54.7% of Japanese respondents consider the present state of Japan and South Korean relations either relatively bad or extremely bad, which improved from the previous year. Additional results that not many South Koreans in Japan support their own country's policy towards the other country, and there is an increasing number of South Koreans that want a new solution on the forced labor issue. Most importantly, both the South Korean and Japan respondents believe that historical disputes between South Korea and Japan might lead to another conflict between the two countries. However, how does the past memory affect the future so much? This can be explained by two theories, which are experiencing differently from each nation. I will first explain the collective memory theory in Korea. So the theory of collective memory is that there are memories that are held by individuals that are shared across the community and affect said community's identity. In collective memory, we perceive, think, and therefore remember events in ways that are great to extent determined by our social groups. Consequently, it can have a significant impact upon our behavior, feelings, and thoughts. These memories, how uncommon or in some instances can be repressed and denied, become an important influence on foreign and domestic policy. This can especially be seen in the political and social lens. The Korean political spectrum is divided amongst these issues due to its partisan nature. Progressives criticize conservatives for being pro-Japan, further deepening the internal divide and the success of prominence in contemporary South Korea of rich and powerful families alleged to have profited by aligning themselves with Japanese sabutsu, or big corporations, often derived as collaborators. Some conservatives have been accused in the past of benefiting from said scheme. Nonetheless, progressive groups continue to put pressure on Japan and demand a response. Koreans agreed that conflict must be managed, and harmony, which is the absence of conflict, is essential in all relationships and situations. Accompanying this belief is the general philosophy of Inwa. Inwa which translates in the Korean language as harmony, is the most desirable state in the community or at work. Since it is an important goal in its own right, all parties should strive to maintain it, and once distributed, and what is the best restored through compromise. For Inwa to be restored, the conflict has to be fully resolved. Therefore, leaders are under the obligation to maintain or restore harmony amongst those below them, and when they do so, they reap others' respect. Because it is the leader's responsibility to perform harmony and dispute management, there is no possible way for them to ignore or avoid the conflict. Therefore, they will listen to each other's point of view, gather information, analyze the situation, and then advise on how to solve the dispute. Additionally, they will address it and try to assist in the management. On the other hand, in the social stage, collective memory has the ability to preserve the memory of events that individuals or powerful state institutions would prefer to forget. This is achieved through public rituals or remembrance and commemorations practices maintained by powerful social institutions, or through the transmission of informal stories and family networks from generation to generation. In the Korean case study, this is viewed especially through youth movements and women groups, as they're creating the narrative and continue to push these issues into light. There has been a widespread adoption of these issues by a new generation of South Koreans. Many did not expect that the second generation would take on the victimhood of the first generation. There has been a massive support that keeps these grievances alive. For example, when asked what motivates them, some young people would say they wanted to do something to support their grandmothers and the movement itself. Another group that has played an immense role in this dispute in the forefront of international awareness is the Korean Council of Justice and Remembrance on Issues of Military Sexual Slavery by Japan. It's basically a council formed by 16 women's groups and this group is a support system for comfort women and provides them an outlet to say their stories, while also lobbying the Japanese government to take actions of a full apology and compensation. These two movements will not allow these issues to be forgotten. Nonetheless, one can wonder how can Japanese easily dismiss these claims. Japan seems to experience the reverse of collective memory by having collective amnesia, which is when an event or a portion of an event is entirely forgotten or glanced over. In 1951, Japan sought to prevent the spread of a view of history that would undermine their political legitimacy. They controlled textbook contents so children would have a distorted and better view of their country's history. One of the greatest issues that the Koreans had with the Japanese government was in the issue of the Japanese textbook censorship. One specific case in this matter that has gained media is when the Ministry of Education deemed that Inaga Saburo's text was too one-sided and that it was too negative about the Japanese war in Asia. Although he revised his text several times, it kept getting denied, further sparking the discussion that the Japanese wanted to revise its history. Therefore, the textbook censorship is one that sparks great resentment from the Koreans, as their version of history is often being disregarded as one left to a simple matter of interpretation, where there is solid evidence available. Another explanation, and there's more explanations, just for the sake of time, I will just explain shame-based society versus guilt-based society. So Japan, like most Asian cultures, is a shame-based society. In the situation with Korea, the Japanese do not want to admit guilt as they prefer to remain silent and above all wish others to remain silent too. It is not guilt in the face of God, but worry of losing face, which is interpreted as experienced public shame or embarrassment. The concept of face is one that is important in Japanese culture as it can be viewed as the sense of worth that is associated with one's dignity and status that a person has in terms of their social relationships. If one loses face, then one is viewed as less to others and you have been disgraced. Hence, Japan put emphasis on the importance of shame rather than guilt, as shame is a major sanction. Shame is a reaction to other people's criticism. In shame, one does not experience relief when his own faults are made public, or even to a confessor. If his bad behavior does not get out to the world, then he doesn't need to be troubled. Confession just causes trouble. In the shame culture, it is not probable to get a confession. Hence, a failure to follow the explicit signal points of good behavior, a failure to balance his obligations and foresee contingencies. Basically, shame is the root of all virtue. So after the war, Japan's citizens began to victimize themselves as they believed they were victims of blind ambition of Japan's wartime leadership, and victims of the United States and foreign nations who had conducted ruthless campaigns or conquests in order to increase their own power. Nonetheless, Japan preferred to put blame on everyone else rather than the emperor, as he was the archetypical symbol of the Japanese spirit and unity. The Japanese have this belief in the concept of wa, which translates to harmony. The concept of wa implies a peaceful unity and conformity within a social group in which members prefer the continuation of a harmonious community over their personal interests. Therefore, it is the Japanese way of saying, we will discuss things, but we will aim for a harmonious whole. Hence, they will endure discussion if they must, but then they will return to the wa. This key factor of idea of harmony is what differentiates the Japanese wa from the Korean in-wa. This shows that the Japanese took a position where immediate issues were discussed so they can move on, but no sustainable long-term plan was going to be willing to talk about if it disrupted the harmonious balance. Unlike the Koreans in wa, for this to be resolved, all points of contention needed to be addressed wholly. Nonetheless, this will not be tolerated by the Japanese, as any discussion of putting blame on the emperor of Japan would cause the disruption of wa, and is believed to be very anti-Japanese. The hesitation of Japan's delegates or confronting these issues directly for fear of disrupting wa causes more of a deadlock at the time of discussions than Koreans would prefer. Although collective amnesia is not ideal when discussing reconciliation, it is not uncommon as one might think, since this idea was also viewed in a guilt-based Germany prior to the 1960s. After the war, people saw themselves as victims, and the children, when they were young, accepted this view. However, once they were old enough to learn about the actual role their parents played during the war, the children themselves became victims of a mentality in which, in silence about the past, involvement was the norm, and they were susceptible to thinking that the slate was clean since Hitler and his henchmen were dead and punished. Nonetheless, they knew in the bottom of their hearts they had occurred in Nazi time is not easily forgettable. It is not until 1968 when the anti-establishment revolution took force, where young people rejected the values of their parents, adult society, and national institutions, believing that they could wipe out the past and kickstart a history anew. The young people demanded to know what their fathers had done, and sickened by what they had find out, they sought to redefine the German identity, rejecting the ideology of xenophobia and racism of the past. Nonetheless, to conclude, we have the question of what is the solution then? How can we make these two countries resolve their issues? Although this is a very hard question to answer because there's so many factors in play. Within the literature, they offer us some solutions. For Japan and South Korea relations to improve, attitudes need to be changed. The dilemma at hand is that either they need to squarely face their old troubles or decide to put them aside. Adopt a usable line about what happened and concentrate on the future. In this case, Japan has chosen the later route. However, the problem with Japan's let's start again mentality is it's necessary a public acknowledgement of what took place and a minimal gesture of reconciliation with the victims for them to move on. Reconciliation is a long-term process, and a conflict and enmity can be inherited from one generation to the next. It may take generations to deconstruct enemy images and build trust. Third, reconciliation is not a linear process. This can progress but sometimes there's relapses, particularly violence reemerges. Additionally, there's a number of factors that can help people deal with the past and envision a shared future with the former enemy. This can be security, which is an end to a violence and assurance that it will not start again. Truth, acknowledgement of the wrongs of the past. Justice, making things right through punishment, reparations, and healing at the individual, community, and societal levels. Other possible solutions toward this issue can be done in two approaches. Amnesty or accountability. Impunity is often legalized by amnesty, and amnesty is a time-honored tool for moving on after difficult times, especially in the wake of civil wars and when there is no clear winner of a conflict. On such occasions, amnesty is often described as an act of generosity on part of the victors, and because it looks like the political expression of Christian forgiveness. There are often supposed economic reasons for indulging in amnesties. However, amnesty cannot be counted on to bring long-term peace and reconciliation since it's unjust to the victims, to the appealing crimes that have been committed, and unjust to the perpetrators themselves by condoning criminal acts. Therefore, amnesty stands in the way of contrast. Accountability is a key to a success as it addresses facts about the past, possibility, and acknowledgement of wrongdoing. But most importantly, accountability is a way of separating the ill-favored past from the present, and perhaps a stepping stone to something akin to future. The reason I chose this thesis, it's because knowing about the past can also lead us to prevent this from occurring in the future and depending how it goes. But yeah, that's the reason I chose this thesis, because I feel like it's such an important issue to talk about, even if it's difficult. Thank you.